Court of Appeals, and in the South Carolina Supreme Court. I'm a part of that appellate body. So this is our website, scvan.org, and then to apply for legal services, it's scvanlegal.org. And this PowerPoint will be shared and provided afterwards. I'm gonna share it with Jennifer, who can share it with you all later. So you'll have access to all of this material after the Lunch and Learn today. So I'm just curious, by a show of hands, how many of you have attended a training that deals with the topic of trauma in any form? Very good, great. So this is a common topic, it's a common issue. I want to, first define what trauma is, and there are lots of definitions of this. There's a medical definition of trauma, and then there are different manifestations of trauma. I like this definition provided here by the Trauma-Informed Care Implementation Resource Center, and it defines trauma as an exposure to an incident or a series of events that are emotionally disturbing or life-threatening, with lasting effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, and or spiritual well-being. This definition of trauma is broader than what it was in the past from the medical perspective. In the past, it was linked more to a life-threatening incident. But now trauma is more comprehensive, and we have a more expansive view of what trauma is. So there was a study done, and I'm sure that many of you are familiar with it. It's the ACEs study. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about that. And it was a study, for those who are not familiar, of over 200,000 participants. It was across several states, across 23 states. And they questioned those participants about their adverse childhood experiences. And the data from this was just fascinating. They found that 62% of the adults in the U.S. have at least one adverse childhood experience. And then 25% of us have 3 or more adverse childhood experiences. So trauma is something that affects a majority of us. But it is higher in some populations than others. So I'm going to show you this YouTube video. It's with Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, and she provides great information on this study and the importance of these adverse childhood experiences.
One of the things that's really challenging.
What's the difference between a child that gets into a top-tier school versus a lower-down school? Trust me, it's not what you think. Hey everyone.
I'm going to try to show it. Let's see. Did he leave, Jennifer? Okay. Because we just pulled it up. I really like this explanation because it gives, it explains the impact of the adverse childhood experiences. So I really hope we can get this to play. It's not projecting. We can hear the sound, but we can't see the video. Yeah, we're just practicing. So we can just listen to it.
Yes.
It's about 3 minutes long. Let me just play it. I hear it?
One of the things that's really challenging about ACEs is that they tend to repeat in families generation after generation. And I will say this as someone who has experienced my fair share of ACEs. Understanding how that might be impacting me and being able to recognize that, for me, is really the key for being able to do things differently. When we understand what happens in our bodies with the toxic stress response, and we understand that it's that prolonged activation of our stress response, then step one is really understanding what are the things that help to regulate our stress response. And immediately at that point, we begin decreasing the harm that happened as a result of our past experiences. So things like mindfulness, right? Meditation, spending time in nature, mental health interventions, regular exercise, nutritional strategies, and my favorite, healthy relationships. The term ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And these are stressful or traumatic experiences that happen in childhood that can increase the risk for significant health, mental health, and behavioral consequences later in life. They really come from a big landmark research study that was done by the CDC at Kaiser now more than 20 years ago, in which they asked adults about their history of 10 categories of adverse childhood experiences, and these include physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, physical or emotional neglect, or growing up in a household where a parent experienced mental illness, substance dependence, incarceration, where there was parental separation or divorce, or intimate partner violence. What they found was, number one, ACEs are super common, and number two, that there's this really significant effect. So there's a direct, what we call a dose-response relationship between adverse childhood experiences and some of the most significant and serious health conditions that are facing Americans today.
So I'm gonna stop it there, but she goes on to discuss some of the physical repercussions or responses to trauma and how it causes some of the most serious conditions, heart conditions, cancer, and there's a strong correlation between the two. And the more adverse childhood experiences that a person has in their lifetime, the greater increase they have for these various illnesses and diseases. So some common traumatic experiences, and this was included in the study, and there are just a few of them here: domestic violence, sexual assault, physical assault, childhood neglect, sudden unexplained loss of a loved one. That can also include abandonment, divorce. That was particularly interesting, especially since we're talking about mediation, so we'll spend some more time on that. Poverty is considered a traumatic experience, and war is also a traumatic experience. And like I said, these are just some examples of traumatic experiences. And preparing for this presentation, there were distinctions drawn between these life-altering traumas, such as war, sexual assault, and then there are smaller traumas, if you will. So traumas with a small t. And so those are things that are, I don't want to say of lesser importance, but it's something that can impact our lives, not as dramatically as one of these, for example, but it can change our daily living or choices that we make. It could be a comment that someone makes that stays with you, that alters what you do and your choices. And those are important too in mediation. So we're going to talk about the science of trauma for just a moment. And I like this illustration here, and it depicts the brain. And it shows the 4 primary spheres of the brain. So at the top, you have the prefrontal cortex. And that is associated with your higher level thinking, reasoning, your ability to make decisions. And in a brain that has not been impacted by trauma, as you can see on the bottom, the non-traumatized brain, PFC, that portion of the brain is actually larger. But when a person experiences trauma, and especially trauma for a prolonged period, the brain physically changes, and that portion of the brain becomes smaller. We move to the second part, the anterior cingulate cortex. That's the emotional control center. In a brain that's not been affected by trauma, it's larger. Traumatized brain is smaller. So there's less control emotionally for a person who's experienced trauma. The amygdala, that's the area depicted in red. Now that part of the brain controls the fear responses, and its primary function is to detect threats. That is the flight or fight center of the brain. And you'll notice that unlike the other parts of the brain, that in a traumatized person is larger. So all of the other parts of the brain become smaller when there's trauma, especially over a prolonged period, except for the response center that addresses fear. That part of the brain becomes larger. And these are permanent physical changes in the brain as a result of trauma. Okay, something's happening with the, it's not responding. If we have a mouse, that would be safe. So the portion of the brain here in the blue, that area controls the memory and the ability to learn. That area in the brain decreases in size as well. So bear with this for 1 second. Having some technical challenges. There we go. All right. So, some common responses to trauma. And so there are cognitive changes in reactions to trauma. There are emotional changes and responses. It affects us behaviorally as well as physically. And I think it's important to actually break these categories down because it's comprehensive, the impact that trauma can have and does have on a person. So when we're talking about trauma and the effects of it cognitively, some common issues that arise are difficulties thinking clearly, difficulties making decisions, misinterpretation of comments and situations, and memory issues. So these are common challenges for those of us who have experienced trauma. And so my goal here is first to have a foundation and understanding of trauma generally, okay? And then we're gonna talk about it more within the specific context of mediation and what this means in the mediation context. So there are emotional responses as a result of trauma: fear, anger, frustration, deep sadness, anxiety, fluctuations in mood. And then some behavioral changes that we notice or observe are risk-taking, refusal to follow rules or the law, conflicts with others, withdrawing from others, and isolation. And then lastly, some of the physical changes that are common: racing heart, muscle tension, headaches, nightmares, tremors, gastrointestinal issues, nausea, trouble sleeping, and nightmares. one thing I do want to point out, in terms of reactions and responses to trauma, it's important to put it in perspective and context that these will vary greatly from person to person. So we all have different responses to trauma. And so a person who's been traumatized may or may not exhibit some of these various, they may have some of these responses and they may not. So triggers. These are events that tend to catapult us instantly into highly emotional reactions, often way out of proportion to the event itself. And then after we calm down, we may look back and regret saying things that we did or that we said while in this altered state of reactivity. And the important thing about triggering is that it's something that can appear small to others, it can be unexpected, but it's a very strong emotional reaction. It can be caused by smell, by sight, by a comment. For example, I remember going to daycare when I was 6 years old. So until that point, I was in an at-home daycare. Went to this daycare and I hated it. Like, it was just this physical response that I remember at 6 years old, and I remember the smell in that daycare. So I don't know if it was a cleaning product, but if I smell that now, I'm immediately taken back to being in that daycare. My blood pressure goes up, I get warm, my hands get sweaty, because I had such a strong emotional reaction. So triggers can be very difficult to detect or to know what they are, but they're very common. They vary greatly from person to person based on memories, and they can usually be traced back to a specific trauma that a person has experienced. So I'm curious, have any of you noticed or had any experiences with a party being triggered during a mediation? I see a head nod. Do you want to share with us the experience?
I mean, it's common when they're talking about, it's the principle of the thing, and it's trauma. Maybe trauma's too comprehensive, but their past relationship, and they jump to conclusions. They tend to be unreasonable.
Absolutely.
So it's understanding that has a history behind it. That reaction has a history behind it, and trying to address what's really underlying without saying, well, I think you've been traumatized by your past.
Right, and that's one of the things that's on my list of things we don't want to say. To your point is, I think you've been triggered. I think you've been traumatized. But we'll get to that. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, so what does this all have to do with mediation? So in preparing for this presentation, I really enjoyed it. There is not a lot of information out there on trauma within the mediation context. So all of the information and research and data is fairly new within, say, the last 5 or 6 years. So this is an emerging area, but a very important area. We often see trauma discussed in other contexts, of course, the mental health context. For the attorneys, trauma-informed lawyering is a very common topic. Within the medical field, discussions about trauma are very common. But there's not a lot of information out there about trauma and how it is important and involved within this mediation context. So I'm going to share with you what I did find. And it's an area that's growing, and I think there's lots of room for development here. So trauma during mediation, why we want to give some thought and consideration to it. One, it can and will impact how parties present themselves. It may or it will affect how parties present. It can affect their moods, their willingness to negotiate, to participate in the mediation itself. And it brings up concerns about safety, physical proximity to the other party, concerns about information being kept confidential and not shared. It can bring a fear or concern that mediation is unfair, given the circumstances or trauma that has been experienced. That last point, that's something that I've experienced frequently, usually within the family law context, where I will have clients who are resistant to participating in mediation. And usually that's something that I've seen throughout the divorce case itself. If you have a party and they've been, say, the victim of domestic abuse, often, or that can go along with the view of, why should I have to go through this process? He or she abused me. I shouldn't have to negotiate or be involved in this. And that's often linked to trauma. It can be a trauma response. It can affect the length of mediation. Oftentimes, if trauma is at issue in the mediation, more time may be needed for that mediation. Typically, they're gonna take longer. So when I was with legal services, the mediations that I would do at the Upstate Mediation Center, all of those involved parties who had been victims of sexual abuse or victims of domestic abuse. Probably the first 30 to 45 minutes of those mediations would require going through a lot of the facts and the history and explaining the dynamics with the mediator. Normally I would try to do that before the mediation started, but certainly prepping my clients for the process of mediation itself. And then trauma can also impact the likelihood of an agreement being reached or it not being reached. So trauma-informed mediation. So this concept and most of the information and research that is available is done or was done by Dawn Coleman, and she's an expert mediator. This idea of trauma-informed mediation, she summarized by saying a trauma-informed approach encourages both the parties and the mediator to increase self-awareness. And I have here a link, if you all have time. This is a video on a TED video that's available on YouTube. And she summarizes this trauma-informed mediation from what she's developed and the key aspects of it from her perspective. Okay, so the 4 key principles of trauma-informed mediation is first to understand trauma and stress. Secondly, empowerment and recognition. Third, the mindfulness of cognitions, emotions, and behaviors. And then last, the incorporation of community resources into the mediation process. So we're gonna talk about each of these 4 a little one by one and how to incorporate them into a mediation practice. So first, of course, understanding trauma and stress. That first step is understanding basically what we've discussed today, what trauma is, how it can appear, how it can impact parties. So mediators first need to have some familiarity with that context, mediation within the context, trauma in the context of mediation. So once that's established, you can move into the other 3 phases of the trauma-informed mediation. So as I mentioned before, we want to keep in mind that each individual will respond to trauma differently, but there are some factors or some indicators that a person has been triggered. So for example, there may be emotional outbursts, expressions of judgment with an agitated voice, argumentativeness, personal attacks, blame, accusations, expressions of feeling victimized, powerless. And then there are nonverbal cues, like a clenched jaw or fist, grimacing, or other facial expressions. And so have you all observed this type of behavior or noticed any of these during mediation? Of course you have, right? It's common, it's gonna take place. Because just by virtue of mediation, you have parties who are at odds. So these responses can and should be expected. So the reason I incorporated a couple of slides about the triggering is because I think this is something that there's a good likelihood that this will happen during mediation. So you have parties who are at odds, they have differences of opinions, and that's a landscape that can be difficult to navigate. As I mentioned, triggers, the parties may not know what they are. Certainly as a mediator going into that context, you don't know what the triggers may be for those parties. So what are some tips if during the mediation a party has become triggered? They've entered that state where you can't reason with them. It's just not going to progress. What do you all do? What has worked for you? I'm sure you've encountered this. The mediation has reached a point where it's just not progressing. No amount of reasoning is working. Do you just stop the mediation? Yes.
Well, I personally just sat through one mediation, and I'm strongly considering to become a mediator. But I use the same tactics that I used with traumatized children. That's who I work with, which is to stop, listen, and however way I am responding to them, I am softly spoken and slowly speaking. And at that time, well, in this particular case, noticed the change, relaxed, came in the seat. They were no longer like this, tense, stressed, clenched, blame, burp, and just waited, just slowed everything down.
So what did you all hear about the techniques that she used effectively?
People just want to know that they're being heard.
Yes.
And I think that is the main reason why they react the way they do, because they don't feel validated and they feel misrepresented and they feel, bullying is coming to mind, but that's not the word I want to use. It's, they're just not being validated, and they're hearing that what I'm saying doesn't make sense to whomever I'm speaking, so you're dumbing me down and maybe calling me stupid without using those words. Mm-hmm. So when they feel validated, when you are letting them know that what you're saying matters, like here, I can tell this is difficult for you, the point that you're trying to make is valid, then they'll be more relaxed. And then you will be able to understand a lot more of what they're saying, and they'll be able to articulate it, because now they're in a mental state of speaking with clarity instead of emotions. Mm-hmm. And you're getting to the point.
Right. Thank you for that. So from what they just stated, a couple of things that stood out to me, they mentioned tone of voice.
Very important.
The pace at which you speak. Those things can be really reassuring to someone who is in a triggered state. That the mirroring effect, so that if you slow your pace of talking, the volume, oftentimes the other person will engage that same way. If they're triggered and upset, oftentimes they will lower their tone and slow their pace and the speed at which they're speaking. So some tips for working with parties once they have entered this triggered state. One, we don't want to reason with them. As was mentioned, sometimes in mediation that happens. You reach a point where there's just no reasoning with this person. As a mediator, if the person is triggered, that's a losing battle. no matter how rational the argument, it is not going to be effective. It's not going to get through to that person because they are working and operating in the amygdala, that part of the brain that deals with flight or fight. That is what is in control at that point. So there's a reduced physical ability to reason and to use rationale. You don't want to say you're overreacting. We touched on that earlier. That can really upset a person and incite them. You don't want to ignore the overall point the person is trying to make. So it may still be valid. So you may have a point or a response from someone that they're elevated speech, they're upset, they're angry, and it's easy to dismiss that point because of the way that it's presented. But it can be a valid point nonetheless. But because they're in that elevated state or they're triggered, it may be lost in the way that it's presented. So we want to take space, as was suggested. It may be time for a break. It may be time to stop the mediation if a party is in a triggered state and they're not able to self-regulate or calm down. Listening and empathizing. So this was exactly what the two of you just mentioned. Really deep listening to a party, knowing and letting them know that they are heard, that you understand that this is a difficult situation for them, really goes a long way in helping someone switch from the amygdala being in control to the portion of the brain where they can reason and make decisions.
And can I just give another example what I did with this sitting? Once they did settle down and, well, are you ready to, start again? And we did. And then I said, if you don't mind, I really want to take down some notes, what you're saying to me, so I'll make sure that I understand what you're saying. So upon doing that, something else triggered, and I was able to go back and I said, well, I believe I heard you say, oh, that's not what I meant. Okay, I meant, and they said, which made sense. And then I go, oh, and the other thing I thought you said was, so anyway, it helped.
To come back to the point
back to the point, right.
Made.
Right.
Yeah. And just the point of restating what someone has said,
Right.
it brings in engagement. I listened to you, I've actually heard what you said because I'm repeating it back to you.
Right.
When I'm talking to my 10-year-old, because I want to make sure I have his attention, what did I say? Repeat it back to me?
Right.
It's a very similar
And
concept.
that's exactly, well, see, like I said, I work with children, so that's
Right.
exactly how I had to, I want to fashion it with an adult.
Right, to make sure they're
Let me write it
engaged.
down so I have it, this is what I heard you say.
Yeah.
Yes, and that helps.
So, trauma in the mediation context, it's really important and helpful to have this foundation and to understand it because as mediators, you have to determine whether a party is able to go forward with mediation or if they are unable to go forward with mediation. And depending on what their trauma response is, it may be that you don't need to go forward with the mediation. If a party is making decisions or entering into an agreement while they're in that state, controlled by the amygdala, that's a perfect storm for a party to come back later and say, well, they calmed down with their rational brain. I didn't agree to that, and want to contest that or to challenge it. The last point about empathizing, something as simple as, I can tell this is really difficult for you. And this is something that it really depends on the situation, because oftentimes, if you respond in a way of, I understand how you feel, that does not go well with people, oftentimes. Because we all have different responses. So we can experience two or the same event, but we will experience it very differently, and our responses will be different. oftentimes to the same event, because we bring different experiences, we bring different histories to that. So if you say to someone, I know how you're feeling, that can be very upsetting. But, as I mentioned before, doing the deep listening, acknowledging what that person is experiencing, I can tell this is really upsetting. I can tell that this is really difficult, can really go a long way. I remember I once had a hotly contested custody case, and I represented the biological father. He was remarried, and his wife was basically the primary parent. She was doing all of the work for their 3 daughters, taking them everywhere, cooking. She was, for all intents and purposes, the mother. The biological mother, sporadically involved, not reliable, but she could not stand the idea of the wife having custody. So my client was biological dad. We made the decision that we were not going to involve the new wife. Very tense, very difficult. So when I would call the home, I couldn't discuss the case with his wife, even though for all intents and purposes, she's taken on this role with the mother. Usually would not meet with her. But one day, my client and the wife came to the office, and we were sitting there, and she was triggered by something that the biological mother had done. And she went on for probably 15 minutes or so. And finally, I looked at her and I said, I'm a stepmother too. And the dynamics are very similar. And so I understand, I recognize what you're saying. I understand all of the other feelings that are coming behind it. You don't feel appreciated. You don't feel accepted. I do understand that. And it was one of those moments, I usually don't say that, where she physically was like a sigh. She gets this. Her husband was relieved, and he had that same physical reaction, like, okay, she connected with her, she understands. And from that point forward, there was a shift, because there was common ground, and she understood that there was some connection there, that I could relate. So future phone calls, when she answered the phone and I could only speak to the husband, no confrontation there, a lot more comfortable, it was a lot easier. So that can be, a little tricky to balance, showing the empathy, so that you understand and can relate, but how that is presented. So with the trauma-informed mediation model, empowerment and recognition is the second step. And in this phase of the mediation, the mediator can introduce these various options to a party who is in the flight or fear-based state, to a party who's been triggered. Introducing choices. So this is a way to enable a party to regain control. So as a mediator, your function in that situation is to provide options for a party. You can choose between A, B, and C, okay? Say it's mediation, or excuse me, not mediation, say it's a visitation issue, presenting them with written schedules for them to consider in that scenario. That's a way to empower a party, because they have control within that context or within that situation. Explain that mediation empowers the parties to determine the outcome of the matter. They're not waiting and letting this be decided by the judge. They have input into that process. And then the third part of this step is humanizing the other party. So oftentimes if a party is triggered, they have a hard time humanizing the other side. It's just they're in fight mode, fight mode, fight mode. So the mediator in that context can help come in and bring humanity to that other side, okay? So for example, if it's a custody case and one party is upset, they're fighting over visitation, okay? And one party, say, doesn't want the other to have visitation at all. As a mediator, you may hear the party who's seeking the visitation, they may say, for example, I just want to have visitation with my child because my parent wasn't around, my mother wasn't around, so I wanna make sure that I'm involved, okay? If you have permission from that party to share that, with the other side, that can be helpful when you're trying to negotiate mediation, or negotiate visitation. You know, this other party just mentioned, they want visitation because they didn't have this with their parent. That's an opportunity to humanize that party, and that can help the, mediation to move forward. Any thoughts on that? Any techniques that you all use?
For me, it seems to be almost always go back to control. And one party feeling like they're being controlled by the other, or feeling like they're helpless to stop a bad situation. So an example was, this comes up a lot actually, where one party will complain that the other party doesn't exercise their visitation anyway, or they're always late, and then we're sitting there waiting for them to show up. So, you know, to come up with creative solutions like a financial penalty if you're more than 15 minutes late, just like the schools and everybody else do. Now, granted, the only way they're gonna be able to enforce that is to hire a lawyer, but it gives them that sense of power.
Right.
To address what is the underlying issue and what is it that they're feeling, and having an understanding of what that looks like. If the meeting place is QT, and they've got the two kids in the back car, and this person is chronically late, and what is going on? I've had kids, I know what that's like. They wanna go in and get ice cream, they're hungry, when's dad coming? I don't know. But to have an understanding of what else is going on beyond that statement of, he shouldn't get it, he's always late, he doesn't care anyway.
Getting to the root issue and the root response, yeah. So that's why I think that's, you know, a really important, thing to keep in mind is introducing choices. Like you said, provisions of, you know, maybe there's a financial penalty, but offering those solutions to parties so that they feel that they have control, or so they do have more control over a situation, like in that visitation exchange example. The most effective mediators that I've experienced come with creative solutions, things that, you know, as the attorney, I may not have thought of, that the parties have not thought of. You know, that's so very helpful. So the third piece of the trauma-informed mediation is mindfulness of cognitions, emotions, and behaviors. So mediators can help parties become aware of and identify their emotions, which then can move them towards problem solving and negotiating. So how can you help parties become aware of their emotions? Any thoughts on that? So acknowledging what you're observing. If you see a party who's upset or a party who's crying, bring that topic up. You seem to be upset. You seem to be agitated. You seem to be anxious about this. And then that opens the conversation to what this person is feeling, and then can open the door to what some of the underlying issues are. So acknowledging what is being expressed or what you're witnessing. Taking deep breaths, as the mediator, as the example that was mentioned here, where you changed your tone, you took pauses, and the other person mirrored that. That can help a party become aware of their own response, their own breath, to slow down. It's also important to keep in mind, if we do notice a reaction or someone's been triggered, not to inquire too much or go too far into finding out what the root cause of it may be. I'm not a therapist. I know that there may be an art therapist in the room, but that's not the role of the mediator and the purpose of mediation. Yes.
I don't know if this is helpful or not, but the thing that I tend to do if I'm in a mediation and someone's getting really emotional is I apologize for being there. You know, I say like, listen, you know, I'm not saying I don't know how you're feeling, stuff, right? You know, you're here because there's something you really care about, it's understandable that it would be emotional, and I'm sorry that you're having to express that in front of a random stranger like me.
Oh, that's good.
You know,
I
to
like
sort of
that.
acknowledge the awkwardness and the weirdness of it, and this is a
Yeah.
private moment that you're, you know.
Yeah, that is great. That is great. And there's so much to that. When you're in the mediation context, you're dealing with usually personal aspects of a person's life, and it can feel like an intrusion to have a mediator there in that role and sharing these details. So that would go a long way. I love that tip.
And also making sure of being, I retired from DSS, I worked for child support for over 20 years. And one of the first things when I went into the room with both parties, whoever was being pursued for child support would come in automatically thinking that we were on the side of the person who had custody of the child. So my job, what I started doing, because I started noticing that, was to let both parties know, I'm not here representing you, we're not here representing you, we're here for the benefit of the child. What do we need to do to make sure that this child is being provided for, regardless of how you feel about each other? You still have a child or children that need to be provided for. And if the person that had custody said something that I knew wasn't right, I stepped in and said, no, that's not right, this is why, because of the child. And that always diffused the situation, because the person being pursued, because you hear things on the street, and if you go in, they're gonna say this, they're gonna do that, and they always come in with their shoulders up because they're already tense and they're already thinking we were against them.
Right.
So at the beginning, I'm not for you, not for you, what's the best interest of the child?
So establishing that you're neutral
Right.
as a mediator.
And my negotiations did not take as long because there was not a lot of arguing and not of back and forth, and they were not, the person being pursued for child support was not frustrated with me, because that person realized this person is here to help me as well as to help the other party. So my conferences were always not always peaceful, but when they got a little out of sorts, they remembered at the beginning, wait a minute, she's here for me. So I was able to say things, calm them down, and we were able to come to negotiation. Hardly any of them went before a judge because they had that mindset of what's best for my child.
Identifying the common goal for both parties. Going back to the trauma-informed mediation, one of the primary goals is to make sure that we do not re-traumatize a person. So as I mentioned before, it's not necessary to go into the details of the trauma or to get that information, because asking a party to replay that or relive it can cause additional trauma. You want to keep in mind that this is a two-way street. So as the mediator, you may come into a mediation with your own trauma, and that can influence the mediation itself. Past trauma of the parties, the trauma of the mediator, and any attorneys can and will have an impact on a mediation. And so this is something that can be useful as a mediator if you can identify or notice a response and figure out how to navigate that, okay? So for example, if you're in a mediation and there's a party who's represented by an attorney, and this attorney is dead set against, say, alimony. Anytime alimony is mentioned, no, don't consider alimony. That's what they're telling their client. You should not have to pay any alimony. This is not an alimony case. And if you can identify, okay, there's something going on with this attorney.
Okay.
Maybe that attorney is paying alimony and there's this response. So as the mediator, you have an opportunity to bring in other options or perhaps other views for that party to consider. That may otherwise not be introduced by that attorney who is, no, you don't need to consider this. This should be completely off the floor.
Can I just say something? I had that situation with the one time.
With alimony?
That one time I sat in and I just said, you know, can we have a few moments before we continue?
Mhm.
And I just said to him, you know, to the person, is it all right if I step in at this point? And, you know, they looked at me. The look was a help. Yes.
So they wanted help against what their attorney was saying?
What they were saying, they
Right.
knew they were right, and they didn't know
Right.
how to get out of it.
Yeah.
And I saw that, and I said, oh, and we did, we excused ourselves, went into another room, I said, listen, can I take over now? I said, please. He said, please.
Wow.
And you know, sometimes that
You
will
can-
need to come in from, bringing in other views
Right.
from, well, you know, the other party has pointed out that you all have been married for 40 years and these other facts to
Right.
give that, party something else to consider.
Right,
Without going into, I'm giving you legal advice, this, you know, is why
right.
this may be ordered. But again, providing those options. But being aware, like I said, of how trauma can be introduced by all parties in the mediation. There is a tool, for the adverse childhood experience test. And I'll send this out with a PowerPoint where you can actually go and take the test yourself to identify some of your own, childhood experiences or potential traumas. So some additional tips for trauma-informed mediations. One, giving consideration to where the mediation will take place. If you know, if there's been a traumatic event, that's easy to identify. If you know, for example, this is a case that involves domestic abuse or some crime, giving consideration to the safety of the parties. That may be a mediation that needs to take place, say by video or by phone. Remember, a piece of the trauma-informed mediation is to empower the parties. And in order to do that, you first have to take care of that need to make sure that the parties are safe and that they know that they are safe. Disclose the setup for mediation before mediation actually takes place. So knowing exactly what to expect, where the parties are gonna sit, a little bit about the environment. Are they gonna be in different rooms? Will they have any contact with the other party? Are they gonna possibly pass each other on the way to the bathroom? I know that for my clients, I usually, as the attorney, have that conversation with them so that they know what to expect, how they're gonna get into mediation, how they're gonna leave any interaction with the other party. But as a mediator, it can be helpful to know or send that information to the parties so that they're prepared for that before they actually go to the mediation itself. Asking the attorneys or parties if there are sensitive issues that could come up during the mediation. That's helpful if the mediator asks that. Usually as the attorney, I volunteer that. You know, I usually give a heads up, look, if we start this by talking about the dog, it's gonna be difficult. This is a hot button issue. Maybe we should come back to something else. This will be triggering for my client. So as a mediator, it can be helpful to ask the attorneys or parties, okay, are there things that I need to be aware of? Topics that are gonna be especially sensitive. And then you can make a decision about whether you want to address that later or first. You might wanna address some easier topics first. Separating the parties or putting them in the same room. Allowing additional time before the mediation to meet the parties and to learn the issues, to really hear them, and to understand what their concerns are. Again, that can prolong the mediation, but it can be really helpful, to have an opportunity to, share and, be empathetic to a party and really listen. Giving thought to the decor, in a location, in the mediation room. I know I've had lots of conversations with, some of my colleagues about this. Decorations can be triggering. Something as simple as, the paintings that you have up. If you're doing a lot of, say, family law mediation, you may want to reconsider having personal photos of, you with your family, your families together. We talked about, or I mentioned poverty as a traumatic experience or event. So something as simple as, what magazines do you have out in the mediation center is something to consider. I remember talking to one of my colleagues, as I mentioned, I worked at Legal Services for a number of years, and one of their attorneys would bring in like Wealth magazine and another magazine with some really, really expensive items. And it was, most of our clients are not gonna connect with this. Like, this sets the tone and gives an impression of you as the mediator or the attorney, depending on who you're helping and assisting. Having props that are available to help parties to self-soothe. It could be soft music, nature sounds, hard candies or mints, fidget spinners, carbonated water. Those small items can really help to calm a person down if they're triggered. Again, you don't want to pressure parties to tell their stories. And then in some situations, it is useful to have accommodations that requires conversations with the parties. You may have a party who needs to have a support dog present, some leniency in terms of rescheduling. So mediation itself can be a stressful experience if you have a party, depending on where they are and how they're experiencing trauma. There may be more frequent cancellations of mediation. And so if that's something that you know ahead of time, that can, create more understanding that this party may delay this process because they're having an emotional response to being in negotiations with, say, another party who has abused them. You may get more frequent cancellations. I'm out of time. Okay. So community resources are the last piece for the trauma-informed mediation model. Having resources to refer people to if they're greatly impacted by trauma, counselors, therapy centers, etc. That's the last piece for the trauma-informed mediation model. And some benefits of a trauma-informed approach: it shifts the perspective from what's wrong with you to what has happened to you. This allows us to see strengths in people despite what they've gone through. It helps us to connect. It puts into context why someone is responding the way that they are. It may not be as simple as they're just difficult and a jerk. It could be a result of some trauma that they've experienced. So it can help put that into context. It gives us an opportunity to create deeper connection and compassion. And ensure that we are not re-traumatizing another party. So that is the end. Over by 7 minutes. Any comments or questions?
We are getting the power.